My name's Shawn Smith. I'm a retired Air Force officer. I served as a Space and Missile Operations Officer, but I also spent a lot of time doing operational planning and working in a field called Special Technical Operations, which deals with sensitive capabilities. And I also had assignments where I was designing and then executing operational testing of Air Force weapon systems. And then at the end of my career, I was assigned to an office under the Office of Secretary of Defense called the Directorate of Operational Test and Evaluation, where my responsibilities were to oversee the operational testing of all space systems under development and operational test in the Department of Defense, except for satellite communications. So in that capacity and throughout my career, I had a pretty significant exposure to the kind of threats that foreign nation states pose to our weapon systems and national security systems, including, in particular, the cybersecurity threats. Early in my career, I had written some of the first operational procedures for what at the time was called computer network defense for the Department of Defense, what would now be called cyber defense. And I also, after I retired from the Air Force in 2017, I spent about a little over a year as a contractor, supporting my old office as a favor to my old boss, doing something called adversarial assessment, where I was helping a team on a project to assess what some specific adversaries could understand and do with the intellectual property and information and access they had stolen and exploited for U.S. national security and defense systems, and with our national security contractors and defense organizations. So that was my background prior to 2018. 2018, I left Washington, D.C. To come back home, fully intent on never having anything to do with the government again. And then in November 2020, I was sitting at home after voting and in person, and I read a news article. And that news article was discussing voter turnout in Colorado. And the claims that they were making in the article about voter turnout didn't seem plausible to me. It was unusual based on what I had seen from, in my own community. And so I started doing what I was trained to do. I had a couple master's degrees on active duty. I spent a year as a fellow at the RAND Corporation as part of Project Air Force doing research. I have a pretty significant research background and have done statistical analysis before, so I started downloading and looking at Colorado's voter registration and turnout data and doing regression analyses over the course of the last, let's say, 6 to 12 elections. And in the course of doing so, I saw some patterns in voter registration and turnout which didn't seem plausible to me, and so the more I looked, the more I found that I was concerned about. Finally, I, for the first time in my entire adult life, read about our voting systems, and I started reading voting system technical data packages or manuals, and then also the test reports on those voting systems. And because of my background and expertise in the testing of complex computer-based systems, and because I understand very well what sort of testing is required to determine the degree to which those types of systems are vulnerable to compromise from cyber threats, when I read those test plans and test reports, I was extraordinarily concerned. In fact, I knew we were in trouble. So that's how I got involved in election integrity. So what Americans should understand about their voting systems is in particular, when you look at the top 5 vendors. So the top 5 vendors of voting systems in the United States are in order. They are ES&S, and then Dominion Voting Systems, and then Unison, and then Hart Intercivic, or Hart Intercivic and Unison, depending on when you look, and then Clear Ballot. All of those voting systems are using computers and components that are manufactured overseas. For the most part, they're manufactured in the People's Republic of China. What that means to the average citizen is almost nothing, because we haven't been informed by our own government of what it already knows about the risks to supply chain and the risks of compromise and the introduction of vulnerabilities and exploits in those systems. So the People's Republic of China is a geopolitical adversary of the United States, without a doubt. We are well aware that they have been penetrating, infiltrating, and exploiting the computer systems and networks of the United States. This is a nation-state level campaign. So when you have your computer systems and components, for example, the motherboards on most Dell computer systems and most Hewlett-Packard computer systems are manufactured in China, and you can see it for yourself. Even the trusted platform modules that Dell uses are in fact manufactured in China. The TPM, or trusted platform module, is a component that's supposed to authenticate the other hardware components to make sure you don't have a supply chain compromise inserted into the hardware level. There's no way that we can trust systems that are manufactured in China by Chinese workers under the oversight or with the influence of agents of the Ministry of State Security, which is a gigantic organization that is focused, among many other tasks, on penetration and exploitation of Western and particularly United States information systems. So even when you look at for example, Dell and Hewlett-Packard computers, and Hart Intercivic uses Hewlett-Packard, but ES&S and Dominion and Unison and ClearBallot all use Dell systems. So even when you look at their computer processors, the central processing units, or CPUs, their chipsets, those chipsets are nominally made by the Intel Corporation, a US company. But when you look at the personnel that are manufacturing those computers or those central processing units, a lot of them are foreign engineers or foreign workers that are here under H-1B visas. For example, on the Intel Xeon processors, the server processors that were manufactured down at the Chandler, Arizona plant, when I looked up the BIOS engineer, it was a Chinese national on an H-1B visa. So when I look at that based on my background, what I understand, what I've seen exploited and targeted and executed by these foreign organizations, the nation states like Russia and China and North Korea and Iran, they operate what are called advanced persistent threats. There are at least 18 acknowledged advanced persistent threats. These are organizations, not individuals, and they are organizations focused on sophisticated and sometimes exquisite computer network and computer system attacks. In China in particular, the advanced persistent threats, some of them are massive organizations. I'm talking about organizations with 12,000 or more people. They have whole campuses. They're larger than, many US universities, larger than many US defense organizations. And they are solely focused on the exploitation and penetration and infiltration of US and Western technology. They work along with organizations within their Ministry of State Security to design exploits and to get those exploits installed into systems that are being fabricated under their watch and supervision in mainland China. Even when you're buying a computer system or a component that's nominally made by, for example, a Taiwanese company, and a lot of US semiconductors are made by the Taiwanese semiconductor corporations, many of those are not actually fabricating on Taiwan. They are what are called fabless semiconductor corporations or companies. In other words, they do the design, but they're not doing the manufacturing. The manufacturing is occurring in a few regions within China. For 5 or 6 years, every single laptop that Hewlett-Packard and Dell sold in the United States, some of which are being used in our voting systems and have been for several years, every single one of them was manufactured entirely in China. Then you get to components like memory or server architecture or modems that are installed in them. The bottom line is that there is no supply chain security when you look at the voluntary voting system standards that are promulgated by the Election Assistance Commission, which was chartered by statute under the Help America Vote Act of 2002. They are the organization that specifies the voluntary voting system standards for US voting systems. So the vendors bring their systems forward to an Election Assistance Commission accredited voting system testing lab, and then that testing lab is supposed to test those systems to those standards. As of right now, and since 2005, there is not a single voting system in the United States that is certified to a standard newer than 2005. So there have been several additions. There's a 2002 Federal Election Commission voting system standards, and then there have been 3 editions of the EAC's voluntary voting system guidelines. 2005 was version 1, 2015 was version 1.1, I believe, and then 2021 was version 2 finally. Not only aren't there any voting systems that are certified to a newer standard than 2005, which by the way is before the iPhone came out, but none of those voting system standards include any provisions for supply chain security until the 2021 standards. And there are no systems certified to those standards, but also the only discussion of supply system or supply chain security in those voting system standards is an assertion that the vendors must have a strategy or a plan for supply chain security. There's no standard or mechanism for inspection or enforcement. And in fact, the voting system testing labs have no expertise. They have no personnel. So there is effectively no supply chain security whatsoever in American voting systems, and we've been using these systems in election after election. The Election Assistance Commission was warned by the National Institutes for Standards and Technology, the NIST, which by law, by statute, is the technical advisor to the EAC's Technical Guidelines Development Committee. So the Technical Guidelines Development Committee is what develops the voting system standards and then recommends them to the Election Assistance Commission's 3 commissioners for their certification of those standards. The NIST warned the EAC in 2015 that supply chain security was critical and that without effective supply chain security, you could have not only compromises, but undetectable compromises which would fully prevent the accomplishment of missions, including the effective use for accurate and trustworthy election outcomes. The EAC did nothing. They never warned the public. We've had numerous supply chain compromises of critical national security systems in the last 8 years. Not one time has the Election Assistance Commission put out any kind of a warning to the public or to election officials in the states telling them, look, your systems may not be trustworthy. SolarWinds was a supply chain attack. It was a corruption of a software element. They spoofed a certificate and then they inserted malware. Once they got a foothold, if you don't know what SolarWinds is, look it up. SolarWinds was one of the most significant, severe supply chain compromises in US history. Pretty much every single major department and branch of the federal government, many state governments, many large corporations, they were using this SolarWinds Orion network management appliance and software, and they corrupted it, and the adversary had a foothold. Even over the last few years, where we've had repeatedly instances where election systems have performed in a way that they were clearly inaccurate. So this is just 2023 supply chain attacks. Airbus, Norton, the antivirus malware firewall people, Microsoft, Colonial Pipeline. What I like about the Colonial Pipeline example is that's critical infrastructure. It was supposed to be secured by the same people securing election critical infrastructure. That's how well they did. By the way, the people, CISA, under DHS, Chris Krebs people, they were hacked by the SolarWinds supply chain compromise. Their servers were compromised for at least, we don't know how long, at least 10 months, and they had no idea. They never found it. Mandiant FireEye found it and let them know.
Government and industry representatives from the election security community issued a joint statement reflecting a consensus perspective that the 2020 election was the most secure in U.S. history.
DOD, Department of Justice, Department of Treasury, Department of State, Department of the Interior, Department of Labor, Department of Defense, all of them affected by that same SolarWinds attack. They still have not warned all the election officials, nor the public, nor notified Congress that these issues were happening. Instead, they have allowed us to use them in election after election, certifying the elections, and they pretended everything was okay. Now, some people might forgive that and say, well, they just don't have the expertise, but whether they have the expertise or not, it is their responsibility, and the American public is trusting them, and they should not be. So 2015, NIST is giving this warning about supply chain compromises. And by the way, can you see those on the side? That first image at the top is a number 2 pencil, and above it is a small power coupler, but it's not a power coupler. It's the fake power coupler that was actually a data relay that was embedded on Supermicro motherboards. Supermicro is an American company, just like Dell and Hewlett-Packard. They manufactured overseas, principally in China. That thing is that small, and it was compromising the server stacks of Amazon, Apple, Google, and Microsoft, among others. It's a Trojan horse, and it's that hard to find. Do you think any election officials are going to notice a component that small on a voting system. They don't even know what's inside them now, and I'm not trying to be pejorative about it or flip. They don't know what's in them, and they can't. Even cyber professionals would not be able to find those kind of things. You have to find them with behavioral. You have to monitor the behavior of the systems and look for things that are out of order. And then below that is an image of just one of those 29 publicly acknowledged Chinese Advanced Persistent Threat Team headquarters. It's 12 stories. They have child care and dental care. That's how many people they have. So why isn't the Election Assistance Commission effective? Why aren't they doing their diligence to warn the American public and election officials? It's an excellent question. Part of it may be industry capture. So a lot of times the commissioners are wildly, not just a little bit, but wildly ignorant about the technology. In fact, all of our election assistance commissioners are wildly ignorant about the technology. Not one of them knows the difference between an operating system and, an operating room. They could not tell you what should be done to secure the systems or what the threats look like. They get briefed by other people. So they hold these hearings. They have positions that are effectively sinecures. They're supposed to be a line of defense, but then, what happens in all bureaucracies? They sort of tend towards failure. These are inside our voting systems. Motherboards for the R630 and R640 servers. This is what ES&S and Dominion are using. Those motherboards are made in China. Next to that is a Telit LE910 cellular modem chip that was on a DS200. On thousands of DS200 tabulators that ES&S sent out and sold to be used in our elections. The systems were never tested with the cellular modem, never certified with the cellular modem, and ES&S stuck a sticker on the side that said EAC certified. When the EAC was notified about it, by the way, by a leftist lawfare organization, because they don't like anybody using ES&S, all EAC did was tell them they had to update their marketing materials. I'm serious. ES&S's actual response was, we did not mean to mislead anyone. We'll tell them to take the EAC certified stickers off the side. I have the letters if anybody wants them. Next to that is a Jetway motherboard, also made in China, for another tabulator offered by ES&S. That photo of the workers, that's a Wistron factory in China. They're making the laptops we're using in our elections. It's kind of a factory town, by the way. A lot of times the workers come out of rural areas and never leave the campus. They're basically under government control there. The bottom is a Dell 7440 all-in-one motherboard. Those are used by Dominion as the computer interface to their ImageCast Central scanners. In Colorado, I found 104 of those Dell computers used for our scanner tabulators registered in Australia, according to Dell, and built with embedded Bluetooth and Wi-Fi dual-band modems in a state where you're not allowed to use wireless to connect to anything outside that voting system network. That was curious. And it's not just Dell. The Hewlett-Packard Z4 G4s that Hart InterCivic uses also have Chinese-made motherboards. Don't worry. The computers are secured with trusted platform modules, which is a hardware device that verifies that the hardware hasn't been modified. Those are also made in China. I think it was it Franklin who said bureaucracies are the death of all good things. So at a bare minimum, they have been captured by the industry. When you look at their Technical Guidelines Development Committee, it is largely advised by representatives of the voting system vendors. And the same is true within CISA. Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Administration or agency. So CISA is an organization, an agency underneath Department of Homeland Security, and they are responsible for a lot of the security for critical infrastructure. So in 2017, just before President Trump's inauguration, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Jed Johnson, designated election infrastructure as critical infrastructure of the United States, placed them under the government facilities subsector, which placed them under CISA as the government agency responsible for security of election infrastructure. Well, CISA doesn't know anything about election infrastructure, and more to the point, they're populated by a lot of people who are themselves not capable and knowledgeable of cyber threats. So when you have large networks like in a government organization or a corporation, you have a lot of management tasks, to configure and secure and monitor those systems. And that's what the SolarWinds Orion product was doing. But what happened was, not unlike the compromise that allowed Stuxnet to compromise the nuclear centrifuges that were concentrating fissile material in Iran, there was a compromise of a driver back at the SolarWinds Corporation that was then uploaded or downloaded onto the SolarWinds Orion products. Pretty much every single branch of the federal government, a lot of state governments, a lot of major corporations like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, etc., their server stacks were effectively compromised. So the SolarWinds Orion compromise was an advanced persistent threat team compromise. It was an exploit that ended up installed. It did what a lot of threats do. It moved laterally, it compromised other systems, installed credentials to give the hackers that designed it, the advanced persistent threat team, more and more access, and also to wipe their tracks behind them so that it was very difficult to detect. And in fact, CISA never detected that their own servers, so this is the organization that's supposed to protect US election systems, for 10 months at least, CISA's own servers were compromised by the SolarWinds supply chain attack. And the only reason they found out about it is because a private commercial company called Mandiant and their FireEye team had detected unusual pattern of activity on their own systems, found the indicators of compromise, which is what you call the indicators that a system owner or enterprise network owner will look for to see if they've been affected by a particular exploit. So they found the indicators of compromise and then passed those on to the federal government so that the federal government could look and see what other systems were compromised. That's when CISA for the first time understood that they had been compromised for at least 10 months. And not just them, but the Department of Justice, the Department of the Interior, Department of Treasury, Department of Defense, basically all the federal major departments, including DHS. But when those are the people responsible for the protection of critical infrastructure, and they can't even detect supply chain attacks that directly affect their own servers, they have no hope, and we should have no trust that they can protect US voting systems and election infrastructure, and they cannot. In the first place, they don't even have access to most of it. You know, when you have a voting system that's been deployed, it's not like that voting system went to a testing lab. A supposedly representative example of that hardware and software went, but it would be like having, you know, one car of a particular model tested and then none of the others are tested. That might be good enough for cars. It's not good enough for something that affects the fate of our nation and in effect the fate of the world. The people who are political appointees at the top typically have no expertise whatsoever. And then when you look over within CISA, the Government Coordinating Council and the Sector Coordinating Council for each of the infrastructure areas, well, there's one for election infrastructure. And when you look at the people that staff it, well, it's representatives from government like Bob Kolaski, who was Chris Grebb's deputy at CISA, and they have no expertise. You know, I think his background was he was an author, an entrepreneur, or something like that. You know, even you look at somebody like Wolf at the top of DHS when he was the acting secretary, he has no background whatsoever in cybersecurity. Then you look at the rest of the people on that Government and Sector Coordinating Council, and they're either industry vendor representatives, literally directly from ES&S or Clear Ballot or Dominion, sometimes, and they rotate those positions as the chair of those councils. The chairs of the SEC are always some vendor representative. So, you know, Dominion's grading their own work or ES&S is grading their own work. But the rest of them are typically lawyers and politicians, you know, like a Secretary of State or an elections director like Lori Aguino or something like that. So not only were they grading their own work, not only were they doing it on the 12th of November when they had no data whatsoever to base it upon, but none of them had the expertise. The only person with any computer expertise, and now Chris Lashin was the representative from ES&S, and he'll claim that he had cyber expertise, but he's a policy guy. He's not a keyboarder, and he's not current, and I'd be happy to have that discussion with him in person. But the only other person that had any computer sort of background on both of those councils was Erica Haas, who was a representative from the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is the organization that was, you know, founded by David Becker with funds from Pew Charitable Trusts, that's been inflating everybody's voter rolls, with phantom and duplicate voters. So anyway, why would EAC not follow up? They don't even have the capability, and it doesn't appear to me that they have the intent. I would like to believe that they don't have any malicious or nefarious background or intent, but I have personally witnessed them hiding information about their failure to reaccredit properly and legally a voting system testing lab, which they then allowed, while it was not accredited, to conduct certification testing, on the basis of which the EAC certified those voting systems as being compliant with voting system standards. So they violated federal law and then participated in a cover-up. And I could go into detail about the individuals who were aware of and involved in that. I've got the emails. As a veteran, I've never personally voted from overseas, but until 2019, every time I voted, it was absentee, because I was usually not in my home state of residence, and sometimes I was deployed. But I hadn't voted from overseas. The same UOCAVA, Uniformed Overseas Civilian Voting Act, that same UOCAVA standard applies. So there are systems in place that are supposed to allow our military members and civilians that are deployed or acting on behalf of the government overseas, to be able to vote securely. I don't trust any of those systems. I don't trust most of the organizations that are responsible for them, because they have a lot of technology involved and individuals involved with no accountability and no independent auditing of them. Our election officials, for the most part, don't understand the technology, so they wouldn't know if they're getting, a real ballot or an unaltered or, a ballot where chain of custody has been preserved or not. That's effectively obscured from them and opaque to them. So for the same reasons that I don't trust most of the mechanisms and the organizations that are involved with UOCAVA voting, I would much rather have our active duty military just vote on paper and ship them back with a shipping service. For the same reasons, I'm very concerned about what we've learned about CONEC. So Eugene Yu is the, foreign national who was the president and CEO of CONEC. And what we've learned is that CONEC, which provides a software service called Poll Chief to a number of jurisdictions, sometimes whole states use it, sometimes it's just counties, sometimes it's municipalities, that what CONEC was doing was collecting a lot of information about election management, including poll worker names, schedules, contact information, etc., as well as about equipment, which was a more significant and critical issue to me. CONEC, through Poll Chief in a lot of jurisdictions, was tracking the voting equipment that was being used and the election infrastructure like voter registration and e-poll book systems by equipment number, by serial number and configuration, and by location. And then storing that information on servers in the People's Republic of China, where there's nothing that isn't accessible to the Chinese Communist Party and the Ministry of State Security. So effectively, what CONEC did and what our election administrators allowed by using CONEC's Poll Chief product, what they did was provide all of that election infrastructure and election worker information directly to People's Republic of China Ministry of State Security.
The CEO of an overseas-owned election software company that has a contract with the Electoral Commission of Queensland has been arrested on suspicion of putting American polling booth worker data onto Chinese servers is extremely alarming. Eugene Yu, the founder and CEO of CONEC Inc., the foreign company that fully owns the Australian subsidiary CONEC Australia, will face the US justice system, and they will determine the facts of the allegations originating from LA County. Regardless of the outcomes in the USA, my concerns are with the sovereign capability, security and procurement of the Queensland election management system, how this firm came to get a contract over local Australian suppliers, and the unknown cost of the CONEC contract. Extremely serious questions still need to be answered by the Queensland Government and ECQ about the CONEC contract, which involves sensitive software used to manage Queensland elections, particularly the personal data of election workers. Eugene Yu tried to sue me for raising issues about CONEC and the procurement process, demanding an apology and compensation last year. I have refused to do so, and I consider the questions I've been raising about our election system and how it's managed and the procurement process to award Connect this contract are more than reasonable and in the public interest. I believe these legal manoeuvres by Mr Yu are attempts to bully and gag an elected representative, and I'll continue to demand greater transparency and accountability, as well as security of our election system, so that citizens have more than just the word of the government to trust them.
What that would allow would be, for example, let's say a supply chain compromise had been inserted into a Dell or Hewlett-Packard laptop, or into a motherboard, or into a memory card, or into some other aspect of a chipset within one of the computers being used in our voting system, or within the computers that are used in e-poll books, which typically use wireless communications. With that information, a foreign actor like the People's Republic of China would know exactly what sort of exploits and backdoors and vulnerabilities existed in the equipment in a specific voting jurisdiction. That really simplifies the process of access, penetration, and compromise or exploitation of those systems. It's like a roadmap. It's telling you exactly where you have to go and exactly what you have to do to gain access, down to the version numbers of software that are loaded on there. And a lot of times in the hardware and in the commercial software, or what they call commercial off-the-shelf software, or COTS, a lot of times there are exploits and vulnerabilities that are published for those called common vulnerabilities and exploits. There's a MITRE corporation. MITRE is a federally funded research and development corporation that advises the federal government, including on cybersecurity matters as well as other engineering matters. MITRE maintains a database called Common Vulnerabilities and Exploits, or CVE. It has, I want to say, over 120,000 publicly known exploits. A lot of times those may take 5 months or 8 months or a year or several years for the public to become aware of those exploits' existence. In fact, we may only determine that the exploits are present after they've been compromised and used by some bad actor or malicious actor. So when you have the data that tells you exactly what equipment is in place in a specific jurisdiction, it's instruction set. It just simplifies their work. They don't need that to penetrate U.S. systems. They've done it in some of our most secure U.S. national security and defense systems. I mean, Russian advanced persistent threat teams compromised the knowledge management network for the Joint Chiefs of Staff several years ago. And that was not a system that they had all that information about ahead of time. They just need a moment. They just need one vulnerability. And sometimes the vulnerability isn't something straightforward. It's something that may take 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 different techniques for them to build the chain of vulnerability that gives them access to be able to then exploit just the one critical issue that was left behind. And then you get into the fact that our voting systems and a lot of the systems being used in e-poll books, as well as the statewide centralized voter registration systems, are using a lot of times dated computer technology. A lot of times they don't have the most capable, highest skill set cybersecurity personnel who would be able to earn mid to high six figures at some of the large corporations in the private sector. These are not always the A-team. In fact, they're mostly not the A-team. And that's not a criticism of them. I'm not the A-team in cybersecurity either. But if you want to effectively defend against those kind of threats, you would better have the A-team, because these guys are routinely beating the A-teams in our national security infrastructure. Right? This is all they do 24 hours a day. So we're trying to get missions done. They're just trying to get inside our systems. So I've been very disappointed lately and surprised a little to see so many people who should have an interest in election integrity calling for ballot harvesting.
I have been pushing this message of a diverse approach to voting and all of the above. And I firmly believe, I'm going to say this, if we wait to vote on one day in November 2024, then Joe Biden is getting reelected. And everything that you're seeing right now is only going to be exacerbated.
That means in addition to Election Day, early in-person voting, mail-in voting, absentee voting, and where legal and applicable, ballot harvesting.
Where to begin with the problems with ballot harvesting? The most significant problem with ballot harvesting right off the bat is that it is asking or requiring voters to give up chain of custody. The first time ever that ballots were harvested was during the Civil War. It was the first time ever that absentee or mail-in ballots were allowed. It was for Union soldiers, mostly out of New York State. And of course, it was the first time that mail-in voting fraud occurred, because it was the first opportunity anybody had. And it's occurred in every single instance of mail-in voting since then. Ballot harvesting isn't a citizen handing over their birthright, their vote, their conveyance of their consent and will to be governed by a particular political architecture. It's not them doing that to a sworn official. It's them handing it to somebody who's sometimes a stranger, sometimes with no accountability whatsoever. The second significant problem after giving up the chain of custody, which is that's like telling kids to get into strangers' cars. That's how bad it is. The second significant problem with it is that ballot harvesting is masking significant amounts of fraud. Because when you don't have accountability for the people who are conveying those ballots in, the ballot harvesters or ballot mules, they can take them and drop them in the mail, they can drop them in a drop box. There's nobody verifying that every ballot they're handing over is an authentic ballot from an eligible voter. Supposedly we have these safeguards that are supposed to protect us, but the safeguards, as has just been recently demonstrated yet again in Maricopa County in this last election, the safeguards like signature verification are an absolute sham.
Maricopa's log file data shows that 11 of these signature verification workers approved 170,000 signatures at a rate of less than between 0 and 2.99 seconds, with a 99.97% approval rating. That's not signature review, Your Honor. Simply flashing a signature on the screen, clicking a button, and moving on is not signature review.
They're just clicking through them, and they don't even know if the signatures that are in the database that the computer systems are showing them that they're supposed to be comparing them to, which they're not comparing. They don't even know if those signatures are valid. In fact, they don't even know where they come. When you have a company like Runbeck, which is operating automatic signature verification as well as ballot sorting and scanning machines, they could literally be scanning a signature off the outside of an envelope, inserting that signature into the database that they have an API or a machine-machine interface with, and then sending that same signature they just scanned as if it's an authentic signature for an election judge to look at. The election judges have no idea. None of them are cyber system experts. They don't have independent auditing. The entire thing is absurd. The third and also critical issue, and this is something a lot of people don't understand, is bad actors are using the ballots that are coming in to model exactly how many votes they need to overcome whatever turnout you can generate. And those ballots, again, that they're producing and injecting, they may not even be from eligible voters. They may be from an eligible voter's name. They may be from a completely fabricated voter's name that has been injected into the voter rolls, because those systems are not secure or independently audited either. The Help America Vote Act 2002, the statute under Title 52, requires that the centralized statewide voter registration systems be both accurate and secure, but there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no standard. There's nobody looking at them. So and this has been demonstrated by canvassing in multiple states. This has been demonstrated by Judicial Watch and their lawsuits against states. Those voter rolls are inaccurate. We also know, because of some reports that were never released to the public, but which we found out about, that the centralized voter registration systems are not secure. So now you combine that with companies like Runbeck, which can print ballots, print envelopes, print signatures on envelopes, print vote marks on ballots. And what you have is a recipe for the injection of however many ballots they want and however many they need. And the way they know how many they need is by watching early voting and ballots coming in from ballot harvesting. So they are counting which names are voting, which names are not voting. They know the party affiliations because they've got the data, for example, from the Electronic Registration Information Center that's passed it on to them. They know who has and hasn't voted. They know who's likely to vote because of their voting history. They know when they're likely to vote and how they're likely to vote if they're affiliated voters. So ballot harvesting is a recipe for disaster. Instead, what Americans ought to do is what it says in the Constitution, is have an election day. They ought to vote in person with photo ID on a paper ballot, and then hand count that ballot at the precinct level with their neighbors. That's how we have an election that we can trust. So federal elections in France, in Canada, all are not allowed to be conducted on computerized voting systems. They not only don't allow the voters to vote on computers, they do not scan and tally votes on computers. They hand count. Just like we used to do, and just like we can do again. I mean, I don't think we've lost the mojo to be able to do, second or third grade arithmetic. You don't need complex computer systems to do addition. If you have a complex computer system and it's supposed to be doing addition, you're probably up to doing something that you shouldn't be doing. So do American election systems or voting systems have hammer and scorecard functionality? So first of all, I should caveat this. I have no direct knowledge of hammer and scorecard. And if I did have direct knowledge of hammer and scorecard, I wouldn't be able to talk about hammer and scorecard because of their restrictions on my access during the time I was on active duty. What I understand hammer to be is a software program and an architecture that does essentially access. In other words, hammer is not something that's so much installed on a target system as it's something that can penetrate through password and other restrictions on a system. So you can think of hammer as kind of like a master key that opens up supposedly secure systems. Scorecard, on the other hand, from what I understand, is a system that was designed to alter election results. So the heart of any electronic or computerized voting system is an election management system and server, which is operating some kind of database and some kind of control system that is supposed to ingest results from tabulators or electronic voting systems and then compile those results and then report on those results. That requires a database, whether that's the old, insecure, inaccurate Microsoft Jet or whether that's MySQL or something like that. So Scorecard is, from my understanding, a capability that can reach into those databases and alter the results to whatever settings the operator of Scorecard wants to employ or create. Now, are those installed on US voting systems? My understanding, again, is hammer and scorecard are not systems that would be installed, but tools that would be used. So hammer to access and scorecard to alter. So sort of like if you had a remote control for somebody else's car, it's not installed on their car. You can just reach into their systems. And this is something that can be done now with the kind of computerization in some of our cars. This has been demonstrated as a hack, that vehicles can be hacked, the guidance system can be modified, especially on self-driving vehicles. But you can also do things like operate the accelerator, change steering proportionality in inputs, activate brakes, turn off the engine, turn off lighting systems, alter navigation. All that's been demonstrated. So Scorecard would be something that would alter database results so that election results would be inaccurate and fraudulent. Is that on US voting systems? US voting systems are using relational databases like MySQL and SQL Server. And so because they're using those, they're vulnerable to them. And in fact, we've seen some evidence that might point to the use of tools like that. In Mesa County, Colorado, the first, second, and third forensic reports conducted on the Mesa County voting system. So this was the image that Clerk Tina Peters took in order to preserve her election records to satisfy her responsibilities and obligations under federal and state statute to preserve those election records. One of those election records, the image of the election management system server, was somehow released online, and then some cybersecurity personnel that was, Doug Gould and Jeff O'Donnell and Dr. Walter Daugherty, professor emeritus at Texas A&M in cybersecurity or in computer science. So the three of them were involved, Doug Gould in the first two reports, and then Jeff O'Donnell and Dr. Daugherty on the third report. So the first report showed that that voting system was vulnerable, that it was effectively open, it was not secured, it was not compliant with the voting system standards, the 2002 voting system standards that were the minimum requirement under Colorado statute, and also that election records had been destroyed on that voting system in violation of federal statute and state statute. The second report showed even further evidence of that and demonstrated the ability that if the wireless systems And in that particular voting system, Mesa County, Colorado, there were at least 36 wireless networking systems in the computer components of the voting system. So these were for a voting system that wasn't supposed to use any wireless whatsoever, and for which no wireless capability were tested, including the security of them. You can see that in the voting system testing lab report. It was really odd to have 36 separate wireless capable components in the system. If any of them were on even for a moment, the security forensic analysis demonstrated that the voting system database could be altered using a free application on an iPhone. The third report was Jeff O'Donnell's analysis that was validated by Dr. Daugherty, and what it showed was that during the course of two elections, the November 2020 election and an April 2021 municipal election for Grand Junction, Colorado, that the databases for the elections were altered in an unauthorized and unexplained manner. So duplicate databases were created and records were copied in a different process or manner in both elections. So one of them was copied in one way where sequential records were copied over, and the next was copied in a different way where the copying of records was non-sequential or had a break in them. And that creation of the duplicate database is not supposed to be possible on those voting systems. They couldn't possibly meet certification standards if that's possible. The district attorney in Mesa County listened to Dominion Voting Systems and then gave a nonsensical explanation before the Board of County Supervisors or County Commissioners, but it made no sense. The claims they made were absolutely nonsensical. The district attorney had an opportunity but never asked an independent cyber forensic auditor to look or advise them. They only took the word of effectively the Secretary of State and Dominion Voting Systems, the vendor. So they did a completely bogus, fraudulent investigation and then just closed the whole thing down. And this is even though that district attorney, Rubenstein, had possession of those voting systems that the Secretary of State had decertified and then provided to him as part of his criminal investigation into Clerk Peters. So the fact that the databases were altered, the fact that those databases were wide open, the fact that the security was not met, I mean, they found that instead of blacklisting all other systems in the world except their own computer system or only whitelisting their own voting system components, the voting system was effectively open to any computer in the world. And it was done deliberately. It was a manual configuration of the firewalls on the system. They didn't close the ports, and they installed wireless networking components. There's no excuse for it. There's something very wrong with that. And if there was even remotely adequate or competent testing in any step, either by the voting system testing lab or by the election administration officials at the Secretary of State's level, and this is not just Colorado, this is nationwide, if they were competent, they could have found any amount of that, some amount of it. They're not even looking. They're not even looking. In fact, I found, and I won't say exactly which state, but I have found voting system computers in US election systems that are registered overseas with configurations that are specified by foreign government organizations. There's no way you could have even a modicum of competence and not detect that. They're not doing their duty, they're derelict at best. They're derelict at best in their duties. Yeah, at this point, even though our own governments and a lot of organizations, including our media, have been colluding against the American public to deprive the average citizen of knowledge of the vulnerabilities of these systems, the compromises, the events where they've been proven to be inaccurate. Despite that, at this point, because so many citizens have become involved and because we've got whistleblowers and we've gotten more data and we've started learning what questions to ask, we have many examples of behavior and results from voting systems that demonstrate at a bare minimum that they are untrustworthy and vulnerable. Now, what we don't have, because in every single jurisdiction in the country, election officials, either because they've been directed by the Secretary of State or because they've been advised by the voting system vendors, they are destroying the election records, specifically log files that are critical to be able to identify exactly what took place to produce these results and to attribute them to a specific malicious or incompetent actor. Because of that, we've been deprived of the kind of evidence that any forensic investigator would need to identify exactly what has happened on these systems. But we have more than enough to know that they cannot be trusted. And good examples would be in the primary, I think it was in 2021 or 2022 in DeKalb County, Georgia.
Right now, dozens of people are hand counting ballots in the race for DeKalb County Commission District 2 after a candidate discovered a problem in the electronic tally.
May 24th, DeKalb County, Georgia. Voters went to the polls to vote on a local county commissioner race in District 2 between Lauren Alexander, Marshall Orson, and Michelle Longspears. The end result from the Dominion machine showed Lauren Alexander received 34.67% of the vote, Marshall Orson receiving 41.35% of the vote, and Michelle Longspears receiving 23.98% of the vote. In Georgia, if one candidate doesn't get above 50% of the vote total, a runoff election is automatically held between the two top candidates, meaning Michelle Longspears was cut out of the race. But Michelle Longspears felt odd about the numbers, so she visited different precincts to double-check the tallies. Guess what? She noticed that in some precincts she didn't receive a single vote. But how is that possible that a candidate with 24% of the vote total finds precincts where she didn't receive a single vote? While statistically alarming, the real surprise came when she realized there was not one vote cast for her in her own precinct, the same one where she and her husband voted for herself. Spears immediately demanded a hand recount of the results and got one. On June 1st, the results were released, and the difference between the Dominion machine count and the hand count was shocking. After the hand count, Lauren Alexander gained 355 votes, Orson lost 1,298 votes, and Spears actually gained 3,620 votes, making her the new runoff candidate. And here's the best part. When you add them all up, the hand count shows 2,810 votes more than the Dominion machines reported on the 24th. This is huge. In the small county commissioner's race, with 15,500 votes total, the Dominion machine tally was short by nearly 3,000 votes. What does that say about all the other races that were conducted on these very same machines? This is proof that the machines cannot be trusted. If Spears had not sounded the alarm, no one would have ever known.
So these are election-altering consequences. You're only finding them when you do hand count of the paper ballots. And that's not to say that the paper ballots are authentic, because again, between mail-in and absentee and early voting and ballot harvesting, we have very few, if any, safeguards to ensure that these are legitimate ballots from authentic, eligible voters. But even with that, the machines themselves are producing results that are not trustworthy. Another example was Williamson County, Tennessee, where only because a single election worker was keeping a mental count of how many ballots had been scanned on a precinct scanner and realized that at the end, when the machine said how many ballots it had scanned, it was not accurate. Only because of that, they took their ballots and ran them through the central scanner, and they got completely different results, thousands of votes different in Williamson County, Tennessee. As a result, they stopped using Dominion voting systems. Unfortunately, they've started using a different vendor's voting systems, and there's not a good vendor, I'll tell you that. The technology is common throughout them. They can put different lipstick on each pig, but every one of them has got accuracy problems, every one of them has integrity problems, and you can go through the lawsuits against them. Whether it's ES&S in 2007 in California, or ES&S with Texas, where their hash files did not match. They're supposed to verify that the software is the correct versions and has not been altered, or whether it's Dominion voting systems, knowing and having Professor Alex Halderman, the University of Michigan computer science professor that was doing expert witness work for the Curling versus Raffensperger case in Georgia, and found 9 critical vulnerabilities on the ImageCast X touchscreen devices, tried to advise Dominion Voting Systems and CISA. Neither of them would accept his report. Then the judge, Totenberg, sealed the report, so Halderman had to write a less specific declaration so that he could release it to the public. And only because of that did the public become aware no election official in the United States stopped using those voting systems, even though Halderman told them they were potentially vulnerable. CISA finally, almost a year after Halderman first made the information available, CISA finally released an information, ICSA, So Industrial Control System Advisory, because they have those under the government facilities subsector, that's the type of advisory they issue on those vulnerabilities, where they describe the 9 critical vulnerabilities and recommended some mitigating procedures for election officials to take. No election officials have taken those vulnerabilities. Instead, they chose to keep their head in the sand and pretend that their systems were secure. So to this date, citizens throughout the United States are using voting systems that have been identified with critical vulnerabilities, positively identified. What was unique about that was a lot of the vulnerabilities that we know about in voting systems are in commercial software because those are in use in other places, and so the vulnerabilities get exposed and discovered, like Microsoft Windows operating systems or Microsoft Server operating systems. But the voting system vendor software has been proprietary, and so the public has been deprived of access to it. And what do we find out the first time that an actual computer science and cyber expert gets access to them? Critical vulnerabilities immediately. That's just one of dozens or hundreds of components in a voting system. And he found 9 critical vulnerabilities just by himself with his graduate students. What does that mean for the rest of our voting systems that are not getting that kind of scrutiny? It should tell us that the voting system testing labs and the EAC are not capable, right? That election officials at our state and county levels are not capable of discovering the types of vulnerabilities and exploits that may be present in them. They are not capable of securing or verifying the security of those voting systems. We are critically vulnerable and we have no protection, and they are lying to us about it. So how would you create fake ballots? The same way people create fake currency. So whatever safeguards you've implemented in them, and most ballots are not being checked for those safeguards. So some ballots have security paper. So they may have different dies or different taggants in those dies, or they may have sequential serial number on them. But a lot of jurisdictions don't even have any of that. So if you have a copier or if there's a Kinko's near you, you can make however many ballots you want. But also, these ballots are being printed at high speed. So you have, for example, Renbeck is using high-speed industrial presses. I think they can print 20,000 two-sided 11 by 17 ballots per hour from a single HP industrial page-wide press. So like in the 2020 election, we found out that there was a Renbeck facility up here in the Denver area in an industrial park. Nobody ever explained what that was for, and after the 2020 election, it just disappeared. You could have a couple or 3 industrial presses in there, and if you need 60,000 ballots, that's an hour. If you need 1 million ballots, that's really just 24 hours with those kind of capabilities. You can print them marked. They have the ability to stuff them into ballots. They have the access to the voter registration systems. So I'm not so much worried about individuals printing fake ballots, although that could happen. There's also that with the dramatic, exponential increase in mailed out absentee or early voting ballots, a lot of those are not going to the actual voters that are listed, if those are even real people that are listed, or people who still exist, or voters who are still residents and citizens in the state eligible to vote. So, in every state, if you look at the undeliverables from the post office, you'll find tens of thousands per election minimum. Here in Colorado, I think we found in 2020 there were, I want to say there was 14,000 in the primary that were returned by the post office themselves as undeliverable. And that was just in one county, actually. That was in one of the 12 largest counties, either the first or second, depending on the year. That was El Paso County. And then in the general election, right after having 14,000 undeliverable, there were 12,000 undeliverable. And those are just like people slipping through the border. You're just seeing a snapshot. You're seeing a portion of what was not delivered directly to the actual eligible voter. So on top of having these corporations that can print ballots any way they want, including marked, you also have ballots that are basically uncontrolled. They're just out in the wild. People could go to an apartment complex or a dorm, or they might be being delivered to some place that individuals or organizations have specifically designated for the purpose of being able to collect those authentic official ballots that are not going to the real voters. So there's a lot of different mechanisms there, but all of that fraud is enabled by the same thing that was enabling the fraud in the Civil War, which is once you lose chain of custody of that ballot, that most critical sort of document related to our fundamental rights as citizens. Once you lose chain of custody, now you're scrambling to try to, mitigate that. It's all wrong. We should be creating a system that is robust against fraud, not a system that we're chasing after it, trying to find it after the fact, knowing something's wrong, but not being able to get the data or monitor all those processes. I don't think they have any hesitation whatsoever to introduce fake ballots and fake voters, and they have all the access they need to do that. And we're seeing evidence of that because the returns that we see in elections are evidence of a synthetic process. There's no way to have naturally occurring voters showing up in a way that the exact proportions move them towards a set point continuously on a slope, as opposed to, sort of zeroing in on whatever the ratio of votes is going to be for that larger population. The laws of quantity and large numbers dictate the variability or volatility should be reducing as you get larger and larger numbers of votes in. Instead, what they're doing, instead of having a straight line that they're zeroing in on, they're following a slope. It's not possible to do that naturally. I mean, if you've ever even tried to get everybody in your car on a trip to go use the restroom at the same time, you know the problem of trying to coordinate even a small number of people. And this is, we have specialists in the military that do this. What we're seeing all across the country, and Jeff O'Donnell's work and Dr. Daugherty's work and Draza Smith's work all validate this, that there are synthetic returns occurring in our elections. Is there reason to hope? Is there something for us to do to recover our nation, to have trust in our elections again? I think so. It's not going to be easy. It took a lot of neglect for us to get here. I mean, don't get me wrong, we've been lied to and, led down this path, but nobody's more guilty than I am of, neglect to my civic responsibilities. I just wasn't paying attention at all to the elections. I just assumed they were being conducted in a fair, manner with integrity. And it was only because of my background that when I started looking into it, I could see these glaring issues and I could see how we've been lied to. But I'm not alone. All across the country, there are grassroots groups that are working on this, collecting data that are revealing these issues, that are challenging public and election officials, that are demanding integrity in their elections. And you can see it, in one state after another. So what can they do? Well, they have to first of all have the intent. Right? You have to get up off your couch. There's no citizenship happening on your couch. You have got to decide that you are going to be part of restoring election integrity in our nation, because without it, our public officials aren't accountable to us. And it's not our government. At that point, we're subjects, not citizens. So if you want to be a citizen, you have to take on the mantle of responsibility that belongs to citizens. And that is vigilant, persistent, endless oversight and vigilance against the accrual of power and corruption in our government, which is inevitable. Our forefathers, the founders of our nation, saw this and they gave us the tools. For example, the federal system, where we can have different effect with our local officials and our state officials. You don't have to get involved at the national level, although you can, in particular if you have the skill set or resources to do that. Everybody wants your help on this side of the rope. But you can get involved at the local official. You should know every one of your local elected officials. You should get involved in your party. You can get involved through the precinct committee strategy. You can get involved in your party. You can go to your public official meetings, and you can demand that they use voting systems and election systems that we can trust. For me, based on my experience, both as an operational tester and what I've seen over the course of the last 3 years involved in election integrity, the only system I trust is in-person voting on election day with voter ID on paper at the precinct level, hand counted by you and your neighbors under video. And if we use that system, I would be happy to have nothing but avowed communists counting our votes, because there's no way to cheat in that system. You have to do it in the public eye. So you have to decide, you have to inform yourself so that you know the difference between good ideas and bad ideas, so that you can tell the elected officials that should be responding to you with a nod and a yes sir or yes ma'am when you demand these kind of changes. You have to be able to go and tell them what you want, and you have to rally your fellow citizens through awareness. you have to rally them to go and support these same type of changes to restore our election integrity. And I know people get discouraged. I never get discouraged. There's no point to it, and it's a luxury that, you know, when you're an officer, you cannot afford. Your job is to provide encouragement to accomplish missions. But this is not the most significant challenge that Americans have faced. It just seems like it would, because we've been enjoying, you know, the fruits of prosperity and liberty for so long. We didn't see this coming. It's going to happen again after we restore it because people will relax. But in between now and then, it's up to us, and we can do it. You just have to get off your couch and get involved.